Hey all, here are OS Reviews. Today we're taking a closer look at the Nokia 8.3. This is also known in the US as the 8V 5G UW. That's a mouthful, but it's because here in the States there is a Verizon exclusive variant that supports Verizon's millimeter wave 5G, hence the 5G UW name there at the end. But regardless, these are both pretty much the same phone. 8.3 is just the international global variant of this device. This was actually released back in the end of 2020, so it's about 2.5 years old. Can be found for as low as $60 when shopping around in excellent condition. So that puts it squarely into budget territory. It was positioned originally as a upper mid-range smartphone, but what's kind of sad is since then, HMD Global have really focused on the budget segment of the smartphone space, and they have rarely ventured into making even premium upper end or flagship grade phones. Consequently, the 8.3 5G is actually one of the more performant devices from Nokia in recent memory, inclusive of the Qualcomm Snapdragon 765G, a 7nm octa-core processor, which is the same chip actually used on the Google Pixel 5, as well as the LG Velvet that we did a revisited review on earlier this year. Performance, especially in the GPU, is obviously inferior to the 800 series or the 8 Gen series, but as we'll see later in this video, it's still a very well-performing processor for everyday usage. The back here is crafted out of Corning Gorilla Glass, same as the front, although the frame of the phone is polycarbonate plastic, which was a little questionable considering the $700 asking price compared to, again, rivals like the Velvet or the Pixel 5, which were all made out of metal instead. Granted, it is a very sturdy feeling plastic. In fact, it can kind of pass as metal in terms of the density. It almost reminds me of ceramic and definitely doesn't feel cheap. Now, the US variant came with 6GB of RAM, which is still alright, although the international variant could be picked up with 8GB of RAM. Phone further came in 64 or 128GB configurations, further expandable up to 2TBs using the micro SD card slot. You also had access to a volume rocker, and the power key, which dubbed as a fingerprint scanner, was pretty fast and responsive. Bottom of the phone housed a 3.5mm headphone jack, super rare to find and awesome to see it here, and also access the antenna for the FM radio. There's also a USB Type-C charging port, which is unfortunately a little on the slow side at 18 watts. To fully juice up the 4,500 mAh capacity cell, it takes around 2 hours. Finally, on the left-hand spine, there's access to a Google Assistant key. Before we dive deeper into software and performance, I just want to mention that it's actually my first HMD Global smartphone that I'm covering on this channel, which is crazy because this is a brand that was created by ex-Nokia employees, and it's headquartered across the street from the real or the old Nokia, and they have bought the licensing to use Nokia as the brand for making smartphones. And this was after Microsoft acquired the Nokia brand in 2014 to use with their Windows phones, but that was kind of a flop in terms of sales, and so eventually they resold the licensing back to HMD Global in 2016. The camera, which I will say is one of the more standout elements of the 8.3, not only is the lens branded by Zeiss, but it also offers a cinematic video recording mode, which captures footage at a very wide aspect ratio of 21:9 at 24 frames per second in 4K. The footage you can also further color grade and also tweak adjustments like lens flare effects, very similar to on Sony's Xperia Mark I smartphones, which are much more expensive. We do have a 64 megapixel primary sensor, 12 megapixel wide-angle lens, and then a 2 megapixel depth sensor plus macro lens, which is not the most useful thing in the world, but it does allow them to claim there is a quad camera setup there on the rear. Really though, you're using that primary and wide angle most of the time along with the dual tone LED flash. And on the front, there's access to a whopping 6.81-inch touchscreen. This is gigantic. Definitely puts it into phablet territory, and this is by no means a phone for folks looking for compactness, but of course gave you a large display for interacting with media content. And it is a very bright and vibrant looking display, though it is IPS LCD as opposed to OLED, also much more common in that nearly flagship territory that they were pricing this thing at. But of course, now that it's sub $100, a lot of these shortcomings are a lot easier to forgive. Nokia also built in their PureView display tech, which makes the contrast just pop a little bit more and converts standard resolution video to HDR. Granted, this is a standard 60 Hz refresh rate, and you also do get a slightly larger chin there at the very bottom of the phone, which on the international variant, Nokia actually put their logo, which I personally actually like a little bit more than not having it, since if there is going to be this larger chin, they might as well use that space. Otherwise, the software experience, like most HMD Global Nokia branded phones, is at least very clean and quite faithful to stock Android. Of course, in the US variant, there are a handful of Verizon apps, but most of those can be disabled, and thankfully there are no additional social media apps that get bundled in, so it's still quite light. However, whereas the international 8.3 already received Android 12, what's kind of criminal is Verizon have yet to unlock the software update past the original Android 10 OS. But now that we're almost approaching the 3-year mark and getting older by the day, I highly doubt that Verizon will actually give the promised OS level update. So that really is a shame, and just something to keep in mind. Again, if you are picking up the US variant, know that as of June 2023, it's still running on Android 10. But for the international variant, you'll be set on Android 12. In terms of programs, at the moment, there's still nothing that you can't install from the Play Store, including apps and content. So I wouldn't say you're necessarily missing out on too much. Fluidity has also been quite good despite the 60 Hz refresh rate. Let's jump into the camera app first, and the positives are this is a very fully featured application. It has certain AI scene detection algorithms that will know if you're pointing at plants versus food or people, helping adjust contrast, color, and also giving you intelligent recommendations. The camera is also fast to focus and really quick to snap an image, as you can tell. Google Lens for image recognition is also built into here, so you can scan barcodes, and even a watermark control, which is a little bit more granular than most other devices that I've seen, where it doesn't just say Nokia at the bottom, but rather you can customize the message that's displayed, for example, your own name or your own logo. There's also a beauty mode that you can adjust between 1 and 10 in terms of strength, plus there is a night mode as well, which will apply similar tricks to Pixels and iPhones, which will increase the exposure time to capture more detail at night. Although keep in mind that this is still a EIS lens, there is no optical image stabilization, so you still have to hold relatively still, and there's also, more importantly, a Pro mode here, which is super nostalgic for folks that have used more classic Nokia phones back in the Windows Phone days. You can actually swipe up to access a dial for adjusting all the properties, including saturation, as well as white balance, and it's a very intuitive overall UI. Now you can also swipe here to the right to access the standard video recording mode, and thankfully you are able to capture footage using all the camera sensors aside from depth. So there's the primary, you can also capture video with the wide angle, plus the macro lens as well. In fact, you can even do a dual video capture mode, which will record using the front-facing 24 megapixel Zeiss optic lens along with the rear-facing primary camera, and you get that split view if you're doing something like live streaming, which is pretty cool. The primary lens can capture at 4K 60 FPS. And then last but not least, that cinema mode at the end. That really is the feature which sets this apart. The very top here also presents you with a little bit of details, including the autofocus, ISO, and once you begin recording, you'll also be able to see the microphone levels here on the top left for the left and the right. So there are in fact stereo mics via Ozo audio, and it's actually surprisingly good. And there's even a wind noise reduction key that does make a subtle difference when you have it flicked on. It will try and isolate only your voice, similar to what we saw in the Pro camera mode. Here we can also adjust all the properties, including focus, making it closer and further away. Now finally, under additional settings, you can turn on and off something called H-log format recording. This is similar to raw images when you're capturing photos, but in video, capturing an H-log allows you to have color grading functions unleashed. More details will be preserved for you to then edit in post-prod, although it does take up a little bit more space on the phone when you have it turned on. One other thing to keep in mind, which is a little bit strange, is if you have H-log turned on, for some reason, some of the extra lens flare effects are not available. So here's an example of a cinema mode H-log video clip. I'm going to tap on edit and then pull up the cinema editor app built onto the phone, and again we have that color grading option available. All of this is going to be very easy to customize, and compared to just a filter, the color grading should supposedly be more evenly applied, and it will just look a little bit more natural as well. And I have to say the effect is quite convincing. It makes it just a lot more fun to capture video in general on this device, and you can end up with some pretty impressive looking results, I have to admit. Super widescreen aspect ratio, content just looks a lot more immersive and for some reason film-like. And then if you're in the cinema mode but you aren't using H-log, of course, you can't use color grading, but you are able to have Zeiss lens flare added onto the footage, which is maybe a little bit more niche, though it's definitely still fun to play around with, as you can see there, and the effect is really not bad. In terms of the portrait mode, aside from just making the entire thing kind of fuzzy, they can also have it look like a swirl, they call Zeiss swirl, or make it completely smooth versus making the background look like just dots or even stars for a more playful touch. So that degree of customization built directly into the app, I have to say, is kind of rare to see. As for actual image quality, thankfully you get excellent results with that primary lens, especially with the HDR doing an awesome job of not crushing too much details in the background and with a lot of contrast and life to the images that make them pop. So it's not just the branding of Zeiss or the marketing behind it, but it really does look quite impressive, I have to say, especially now that you can find this thing in that sub $100 price range. You can still get some gorgeous results that are very satisfying to use for preserving your memories or even sharing on social media. Here's an example of the wide-angle lens, by the way, which of course will have a little bit of distortion on the edges, not quite as sharp as the primary 64 megapixels, which by the way, by default, will bin itself down to 12 megapixels to save on space. As well as just how fast the images are to snap on this thing, it does still feel like a relatively high-end experience, definitely one of the highlights of this device. Now moving into a quick video streaming and audio test here on YouTube next. Some takeaways being that, at the very least, the speaker can get quite loud, but as you can hear, it is not quite as satisfying as a true stereo speaker, which is a little bit of a shame since on some older Nokia phones, namely the Nokia 6 and 8, I believe they had the earpiece dub as a stereo unit, but it's still serviceable, and perhaps the best thing about it is you do get a regular headphone jack, or you can always use Bluetooth to connect to additional peripherals. Overall, again, this is an excellent display. It's large, so it's very immersive for watching back video content. A small hole punch camera cutout there doesn't really disrupt your viewing experience, and that upscaling to HDR does make content really pop and look very vibrant on the screen. It's also completely flat, so you don't get too many accidental touches compared to a curved panel. And overall, this very energy efficient 765G still holds up quite well when it comes to regular interactions and navigating around. Reception quality also remains excellent because of that polycarbonate frame, so I'm consistently getting almost full bars regardless of if it's Wi-Fi or if we're looking at cellular. Something else that this phone gets right, though, would be the haptics. It's super tight and precise and very satisfying. It also not only becomes something you can feel when you're typing on the keyboard, but also in that previous camera app. Changing things like exposure and focus, there were some noticeable clicks that I could feel with my finger as I was swiping back and forth. Overall, web browsing also remains a breeze for this phone to handle. There is really no pages that this thing can't load. We can even try and go into the desktop version of the site, and you can tell that it's still a very fast and responsive process despite a lot of videos, and it's a pretty complex web page that we're looking at here in general. I was still able to open around 5 or 6 programs, and it didn't feel too slow as I was jumping back between them, which is great. But again, if you are getting the international version, the 8 gig model would probably perform even better in that regard. A couple of other basics on this phone, including double tap to wake the screen, also does a reasonable job. The fingerprint scanner is also relatively fast. Other wireless connectivity on the phone, including NFC for contactless mobile payment, as well as standards like GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, all again work pretty much as expected and had no real complaints in that regard. The multitude of microphones on here also, again, do a great job of picking up your voice. So if you are using it as a phone, that's where having actually a slightly larger and taller form is beneficial, since this thing is a lot closer to your mouth anyways. As for doing a bit of moderate gaming, this thing can still handle all of the titles you'll find from the Play Store, even including more graphically demanding games as well, like PUBG and Asphalt, are workable on the 765G. This thing really is no slouch, and it still holds up quite well, especially if you are running it in, say, medium graphic settings. Loading times are even quite quick. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the Nokia 8.3 5G, also known again by the pretty poorly conceived name of the 8V 5G UW in the United States. However, it's still, I think, a perfectly serviceable phone, to be honest. Again, similar to something like how a Pixel 5 would feel here in 2023. So it's a little bit bittersweet that HMD Global haven't been doing maybe quite as well as what many fans, I think, had hoped when they heard that Nokia, or at least the brand, was making a bit of a resurgence, and they want to still see more unique flagship grade devices from this Finnish company, which are more powerful and push the boundaries like the iconic Nokia of yesteryear once gave us. Devices from them these days tend to be a lot more safe and, again, in the budget range, but this thing I think has held up very well, and if you do want something with an excellent video recording camera, it actually is a specialty. The phone had a tie-in with the James Bond 007 movie No Time to Die, and because the movie got delayed, the launch of the 8.3 5G also got pushed back by several months. If they had managed to launch it 6 months prior, it would have maybe gathered a little bit more of a splash in the media. But nonetheless, I think this is a very solid smartphone from them. And again, especially now at this very low price point, I think it's a super compelling device. So you can check out more details if interested in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Nokia 8.3 5G, also known as, again, the 8V 5G UW, revisited.